Give a warm welcome to director Jeff Zimbalist.
Thank you. Jeff. Thank you, guys. How many people had read Mailer before this screening? I'm thinking at half. So we did our job of reaching Mailer fans and non-Mailer fans alike, hopefully. Thank you, guys. What a great turnout. And what a nice subwoofer. Good tech.
Got great sound in here. You starred this film. It's so gutsy in the middle of things and one of the darkest chapters in his life. You could have turned off the entire audience by starting at that point. Tell us about.
That's a great question. I mean, we were approached by the Mailer family, by the state, and often when an estate approaches you, they want a hagiography. They want to celebrate their lost loved one, and they say they want warts and all, but they don't really mean that. And in this case, I said up front, I don't want to make a celebration of the enduring legacy of some intellectual titan, because this guy has ego and fault and vulnerability, so many mistakes. And on that initial call, they said, well, Dad would have wanted us to hand him his ass. He would have wanted, he put himself out there as a scapegoat his whole life, and especially when times were hard and stakes were high, he doubled down. He wanted to be used as a target. And he prophesied that we would end up in a moment like this. Polarization, cancel culture.
Right.
We would be dying of timidity, and he would have wanted us to use him as a scapegoat, as a target. And so the family gave me all that on the first call. Usually I'll pitch something. I'll say, we're going to have to expose sides that are going to be uncomfortable to the family, and there's crickets on the other end, and they just jumped all over it. They're like, let's start with the stabbing. It was actually, so there was 2 daughters that were in the house when the stabbing happened, and one of them, Danielle, was on the first call. It was her and John Buffalo. And she very courageously was like, I want to show audiences that we're not afraid to go to the dark side, and show Dad for who he was. And that means we should start with the stabbing. And it was a huge trauma in her life. So it was right from the beginning that I knew we shared a sensibility around not making the film one-sided and actually making the film about ideas, using Mailer to talk about ideas.
Were you concerned about alienating the audience from the get-go, or did that cross your mind, or were you just fearless? Let's just.
I didn't ever think that the audience needed to sympathize with Mailer the whole time. We kind of went in saying there's parts of Mailer that might inspire us for 10 minutes at a time. They may push us to find greater courage in ourselves, but he's not going to be a hero. And you don't have to love Mailer to be ignited by his ideas, to be provoked by his work, and you don't have to hate him to learn from his mistakes. And so I think part of what I hope the experience is that each audience member draws his or her own threshold for what's too far. So maybe for 5 to 15 minutes, you're like, yeah, I could do a little more of what Mailer's doing in my life. And then he does something outrageous. You're like, I'm really glad I didn't do that. And you then know what your threshold is.
I mean, what you just said is what I love about your documentary, is that, like, I didn't have to like this person, but what I'm getting, the way he lived is so inspiring. Was that something that was conscious to you from the beginning, that the audience doesn't have to sympathize with him, but at least learn from the way he's lived?
Yeah, my hope is that it functions like a tug of war, and that you're engaging with parts of Mailer that feel worth engaging with, and you're dismissing the parts of Mailer that feel like they're too outrageous and go too far. And that by doing that, each audience member asks questions about ourselves and how far we're willing to go as artists, as creators, in our life. So yeah, I do want the film by the end to feel like there's something in Mailer's teachings that are valuable to this moment in time right now. And and most of all, I think the idea that we need to find that thing in us that must be awakened to come alive is a beautiful idea for a time when we're so afraid. And And I wanted to end on that upbeat, but that couldn't be at the expense of it being a cautionary tale. And so the opposing dimensions of Mailer, making a film about nuance, about the complexity of somebody, was the great challenge. In a time when there's so much pressure from financiers, from distributors, to make something that takes a clear stance and says this is a good person or this is a bad person. And we hope to do that in the title even, right? It's How to Come Alive with Norman Mailer, parentheses, a cautionary tale. Hopefully it's all in there.
It is such a dense documentary in a really amazing way, layers upon layers. I'm used to seeing films where they show you, but you allow the words, you allow the density of the material to be at the forefront. Tell us about that approach.
Yeah, we started with this idea of, can this be about an idea rather than a person? Can this be about our love-hate relationship with complex ideas? And then through these rules that Mailer has for how to live, we will also then secondarily track his arc, right? We will have his transformation from the good Jewish boy who is trained and conditioned to not call attention to himself because of fear of anti-Semitism, to him pushing right through that to the other end of the spectrum and being as loud and outrageous and calling for as much attention as he can get and trying on all these faces and masks and personas, and then softening back into that nice Jewish boy who doesn't need the external validation as much by the end. Mm-hmm. Can that arc come through a container, a structure that isn't your classic chronology, biopic, cradle to grave treatment? And using these rules, these ideas as the mechanism to make it episodic, to build in the sections, felt like a more innovative approach where the ideas were first.
And yes. Any questioning from as you were building this beast, that this might be too dense, it might be
Oh yeah, we were so scared of that. I mean, I was scared of that even at the pitch stage. This is not someone who's read in canons anymore. Mailer's been canceled 15 times over, and then again, 2 years ago for The White Negro. A lot of people don't know who Norman Mailer is. He's certainly not going to sell more than a few tickets at art house cinemas, right? So you're not going to get this financed on his brand or his name recognition. And then on top of that, yeah, he's not a good guy. And so that's a tough sell. I mean, he's a womanizer, he's a white male, he's a chauvinist, and people call him all sorts of other things. And then on top of that, it's cerebral. It's about ideas. And all of that is working against us in a climate like this, in a marketplace like this. So it was really a miracle that we were able to find a way of talking about Mailer's life, and that others, the interviewees, were able to find a way of very eloquently talking about his life that has proven to make this accessible. First of all, to get us the money to make the thing, which is incredible, and then to be, having a 50-city theatrical run with this and have, 200 people here tonight. It blows my mind that we were able to somehow reach people with all those obstacles stacked against us.
Tell me about the sound design and the composer, which is equally as complex as the subject matter. I mean, I hear there's typewriting sort of background sounds.
Yeah, that's a great next question. I like the juxtaposition because we were trying to make the ideas and the A-roll and the interviews as accessible as possible while still maintaining the layers. But aesthetically, we were trying to be weird. We were pushing it as avant-garde as we can go because we thought that's what Mailer would have wanted. And so Jacques Brotbar did the score, and we knew we needed a space that would invite us into Mailer's process, into his creative mind, because to me, that was always the most fascinating place, right, to spend time with Mailer. And the typewriter, the clack of the typewriter in metrics, in rhythm with the BPM felt like a way to get us into the quick pace of the flow of his ideas, and then to be really abstract with the imagery when we're in that subjective POV. So we use flowers blooming and wilting.
And the bullfighter.
The bullfighter's a little more literal, and then we use the fireworks when he's talking about strangling a woman in American Dream. You know, and the imagery around the stabbing of Adele, we did a lot of trial and error with archival that's unrelated, but we worked with the family to get their feedback and sort of what gave off the right impression. At one point, we had an Adele interview, an archival interview with her before she died, and it really brought that section to life. You understood her pain as the victim, and unfortunately, at the last minute, the owner of that archival decided that he didn't feel comfortable with us using it. So we had to come in there and create that energy through image and sound design without the voice, and it was a challenge.
I'm glad to hear about because when I was watching the documentary, that was the one thing I was wondering, we're not hearing from Adele. Would you mind sharing what she said?
I mean, she was sobbing, and it was really, she was super traumatized in the interview and hardly able to get her words out. And so the question the owner had of the footage was whether or not that was doing her, that was an integrity way to present her to the world, because people, both in the family, her daughters and others who knew her, they remember her as an artist who was strong-minded, strong-willed, and strong-voiced. And to have that be the only representation and that sort of form part of her legacy didn't feel honest.
Mm-hmm. But you mentioned, I mean, obviously Buffalo and the other family members were involved in the project. Did you ever have, criticism from them saying, don't do this, let's do it a different way, et cetera, or you had free reign?
Yeah, we really only checked with the family on accuracy, and that was understood, that there was no creative approval process, that this wasn't going to be workshopped with them. They had to trust us, and that was a super courageous thing for them to have done. And it was high stakes for me, because yes, I want the film to emote and provoke to audiences, but I want it to play well to the subjects who gave so much of themselves and went to such an intimate place for it. And we premiered at Doc NYC in New York, and everybody came and everybody loved it, and I was just super relieved. I mean, this group of interviewees, I've been doing this over 20 years now, by far the smartest, most eloquent, most provocative, as a whole, as an ensemble of interviewees, and there was over 30 interviews for the film that I've ever worked with. I mean, each person has fine-tuned their storytelling voice, their artistic voice, their way of expressing themselves. Each was so unique and really unafraid to speak ill of Norman, to deal him his punches when he deserved it. And so we just had incredible material approaching the man and his psychology from so many different angles.
I want to go back to the idea of how dense the material is. And I was thrilled the fact that it is highly entertaining, but then at the same time, I'm like, you're not pandering to me, you're like elevating the conversation, and it's so dense. Tell us about finding that balance between, entertaining us and engaging us, but at the same time not talking down to us. Like you elevate the conversation in the documentary.
Oh, thank you. I mean, that's the greatest thing to hear, because that was the biggest challenge. And yeah, I don't think we ever felt confident that we got that balance right, but we did focus group the film a lot. I mean, not with the family, that was for accuracy checks, but we did show it to other storytellers, both literary, intellectual, and filmmakers, many, many times to make sure that it didn't, drag, get too dense. There was a lot of thinning. There were so many good ideas that to me made sense next to each other, like the flow of ideas did build on each other, but when you put that in front of someone who's never seen the film before and is trying to catch up on the plot, the time period, the political and social context of what's going on, it was just too much. And we did specifically play it for teens and people in their early 20s, and wanted to make sure that they were able to track the various different layers as well. So pruning back ideas and killing darlings so that really only the ones that did make sense to the widest group of people stayed in the film. to the point where sometimes I felt like we're going too far. We're minimizing the complexity of his ideas. We're dumbing it down. We're watering it down. But the feedback we've gotten now that the film's been out is that it still has plenty of meat and layer.
And when did you come to the narrative structure with the chapters? When did you latch down to that?
So I often find the structure through playing with the cold open. In this case, we started with a very thin, more intrigue, mystery-based cold open that was just about the stabbing, and then realized that people need a lot more to want to stick with this. And so we built in a quick history of what Norman's done and his achievements, and that he's this outlaw. And then we even built in an introduction to all of the interviewees to say, these are your storytelling voices. And it was there that I was like, but what is the main thing that we want these interviewees to help us understand? And it was through that process, through that investigative question, that we got to the idea of, well, they want us to know what Norman's rules are for how to live your most inspired alive life, and let's watch those and let's keep an eye out for where he's wrong, and that became the structure of the movie.
I was stunned at how prophetic this man was. Is that something that you discovered in the process of learning about him?
Yeah. I'm very nostalgic for the era of the public intellectual, when great minds informed the masses, not celebrities, and town hall debates like that and idea sparring were considered noble cultural contributions. And when at that time it felt like we needed the provocateur and the agitator and the contrarian, whereas now there's a fear of being the agitator and the contrarian. And so he represented a time that I think was really fruitful for elevating our discourse, national discourse, and he also warned us throughout his life about losing all of that. And we knew that was, from the very first conversation we had with the family, that was going to be a big part of the film, is how relevant these ideas are today. I mean, he talked about talk shows becoming echo chambers. He talked about books losing out to fragmented technology and entertainment, big ideas getting reduced to memes, people being less and less tolerant of ideas that don't agree with their own, people being uninterested in learning to think for themselves. I mean, all of these things started coming true during his lifetime, and he fought against all of those trends, and we wanted that to really be loaded heavy at the end, as a way for us to leave the film hopefully reflecting on perhaps how an instigator or two could help us nowadays.
We briefly talked outside about that. As brilliant as a writer he was, a brilliant mind, he was a god-awful filmmaker. The worst. And tell us about latching on, which is brilliant, Maidstone, and working that into the narrative.
That's one of the things that we were really blessed with, is we have Richard Leacock, we've got Maysles, we've got D.A. Pennebaker filming Norman Mailer during this time. I mean, we are gifted with the greatest cinematographers of the era, the guys who invented direct cinema, cinema verite, and we had the raws from their outtakes, their footage of all of this. So they took something with Maidstone that was not a good film on its own and made it a really fascinating study in the ethics of being a camera person when there's no rules, when the lines between fiction and nonfiction are that blurred, and that rip-torn hammer scene. Obviously, the Town Bloody Hall, where the all-stars of the women's liberation movement get to sort of bite back at Mailer, and he accepts that this has been a fruitful evening, right? The film isn't what it is without the footage of those guys, and so I'm really grateful they were there to capture this all. As far as Mailer being a filmmaker, he's received so much flack for that his whole life. I don't need to add to it, but I agree.
But it's so revealing at the same time about who he is. I mean, you watch, I talked to you about Tough Guys Don't Dance with Isabella Rossellini and Brian O'Neill. It's an awful movie, but you watch it and you learn so much about who he is. I mean, he put his heart into his soul into the filmmaking.
Yeah, and he was very arrogant, right? He pushed back against all of the teachings of all of the masters and everything that anyone told him would work. So I think to a certain extent he let his head get a little bit too bloated when it came to being a director, and that a lot of people in the film world were not willing to therefore grant him the kind of liberties that they might have in the literary world, where he did put the work in, where he put the sweat and tears in over decades.
Mm-hmm. After all the time that you spent in this project, how do you feel about him? Did you grow to love him, to respect him more?
I can relate to Norman in a way that I think is somewhat unique, in that I'm raised by second-generation Jewish immigrants who survived the Holocaust, moved and settled in New York City, and became intellectuals and artists. I respond to tough love. I mean, our dinner conversations growing up were people talking over each other, challenging and interrogating each other. This style, to me, is familiar. And so, yeah, I think I'm able to put it in a different context. And it's partly why his work resonated for me as a young artist in training in my teens, is that tough love approach of, unabashed creative courage. And if you really want to understand the human condition, if you really want to understand your creative capacity as an artist, you can't be afraid of the response. Those things deeply spoke to me, and I'm glad I had the opportunity to make those more available to other people who they do also speak to. In that way, I'm proud to celebrate parts of what Mailer represents, without hopefully making him seem like a role model.
Yeah. I want the audience, you guys love this documentary, right? So I want you all to be aware that currently on Netflix, he has another documentary that just came out called Skywalkers. And do yourself a favor, go home tonight or tomorrow and watch this documentary, Skywalkers. And what is so brilliant about watching both so close to each other is that the content of the documentary sets the style, and it shows your artistry. Tell us about that aspect, that you change the style to fit the content of your subject matter.
I love that. Thank you very much. I'm very flattered that you said that. To me, the growth in this form is putting myself out of my comfort zone, taking projects that scare me, and usually that means the content demands a form that I haven't done before. And so pushing my own boundaries to try to find a form that meets the content is my way of growing through the medium. And I've never done a film about a writer before. I've never done a film this overtly about ideas before. And with Skywalkers, there are no interviews. It's just, verite following this couple that trespasses onto the world's highest buildings and does acrobatic stunts. And we use extreme climbing as a metaphor for romantic trust. It's not about the fear of falling from heights. It's about the fear of falling in love. So I'd never done a film like that, where we're using sport as metaphor for romance and relationship. And when an idea like that occurs to me and it scares the shit out of me, usually it's a good sign that I need to try it, and I need to stick to it, because often the first 6 months of a process like this or like Skywalkers is a lot of naysaying and people who are afraid that you're doing something that's not very clear for a while, and then when you find it, it's the most rewarding thing.
That's the one thing that blew me away by watching Skywalkers was what you just said, that it's a metaphor to love. And when I realized that, it knocked my socks off. I mean, you're watching, guys, go home and watch it. Do me a favor. You watch these two people that are into climbing this crazy buildings, and you get to see the heights. And if you have fear of heights, you're going to be sweating during the whole. But it is a love story. Did you always know that connection, that when you were making that documentary,
that was 7 years in the making. It's funny, we're talking about a film you haven't seen.
Well, you're going to go home and watch it.
Yeah, we'll have it here tomorrow. It was 7 years in the making, and that idea for it to be a love story in the world of rooftopping didn't actually get formalized until maybe a year and a half into it. Just like the idea of using the rules to come alive didn't come together until months into this process. But when that vision hits in both cases, then you know it's your North Star and you know you need to stick to it. And even if the film pulls you in other directions, like with Skywalker, sometimes it said it wanted to be more of a heist genre or a thriller genre. Sometimes it wanted to be more political because it's during the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But even though we can explore those other angles, you just have to bring yourself back to that initial nugget. That North Star and that anchor that, no, we said this is going to be a love story. Every single scene, every single line of dialogue in this movie needs to forward, advance, layer on the love story and not these other stories. And that kind of discipline, I hope is what makes it accessible to audiences who could care less about heights and rooftoping.
Mm-hmm. Which brings us back to Norman Mailer, that no matter what we feel about him, it's the lessons that we get from Mailer that ultimately, it doesn't matter how we feel about him, correct?
Right, yeah, it doesn't matter to me, and I don't think it matters that much to the family that everybody goes home and reads a bunch of Norman Mailer books. I think if there's something universal in his journey that forces us to be introspective and ask smarter questions, and give smarter answers in our lives and about ourselves, then it works.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here.
You guys, thank you very much.
Yeah. And you guys have homework. Go home and watch Skywalkers.
Thank you, man.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.